So I think we're good. Let's start, right? So I've been kind of already presented, and the talk is a bit more of like that kind of like from fail to grace story. But let's go at it. Failing at scale. Oh, of course, not. Yeah. So about me, right? Like you already know that I'm called Tiago. I was actually born in Lisbon during the Jurassic period, and then in 2014 I moved to Stockholm, Sweden, where I kind of been there, like been here for a while, and worked on 6 design systems until now. Uh, Also love to code, and all of those 6 design systems have some code contributions from my side. And I'm currently working at Transfer Galaxy, which is a startup that allows immigrants to send money to their loved ones with basically ease and much lower cost than the traditional competition. So we're going to be talking about something that was a bit unpredictable when I started building the Figma library for Gloss. And Gloss is the website design system that's part of the Klarna design system. So in case you know the term system of systems, it's pretty much what we had at Klarna. So let's talk about Gloss. Gloss was a Figma library, as I already said, with 68 plus components. These are modular components with up to 4 breakpoints because we're talking about websites. So we're talking about mobile towards large screens. So different layouts that need to be covered. It's multi-brand. So it supports at this point Klarna, the business to consumer facing part, Cosmo, which is open banking, and so forth, which is a German Klarna competitor that Klarna purchased at some point. We also have a clipboard, which is pretty much like also known as a sticker sheet. So pre-built components, pre-built pages, starter pages, you name it. And then we have like so many templates. Like we have templates for creating assets for the website, creating like hero images, creating phones with hands on them, all sorts of stuff. And of course, on the component on the developer side of things, we're talking about the React framework. So let's talk about the inception of this problem that's going to be like super obvious in a while. So I started building the component library in Figma, and I used the base component architecture. Like at that time was kind of like advised, like Figma really advocated for that. And you can see on the right side, it's a base button with the underscore. So it means it's a private component that doesn't get published. And then you basically build the button variants out of that base component. So the goal here was, in case you needed to kind of change the border radius or the default color, you did it just once and not on the maybe 900 variants that you had. So you can see that everything that is needed to have all the different variants of the button is already there, right? So an icon on the left, the button label, an icon on the right, the loading spinner. You see the complexity. This is a very simplified variant case where it's just the different colors. But if you add like interaction states, if it has a spinner, all of the different states of icons, it can grow for a little bit of a big thing. So here's an example, right? Here's a card. There's buttons on it. You already see that it has a lot of variants for the different like permutations of how a card might look like. Then you have the card grid, which already takes that card component with all of those hidden layers, right? And we're talking about 4 breakpoints, so you have variants for each breakpoint, and 1 variant for kind of like the basic amounts. And so it's like it starts getting a bit tricky, right? Like the complexity is growing. And then you have the block. The block is pretty much like a section on the website page. And the block is pretty much using the slot component or technique that Figma also kind of like advocates for a lot. So the way that we can explain this is you can slot any component in that green area. And so you keep like things like the overall layout, the grid, the paddings, but then you can actually just change that green area for any other kind of component. In this case, it's like I already shown you the card grid. The card grid would slot inside of the block. Okay, So what started happening? This started happening. Memory started running low, right? Like the file started to get very heavy, very complex. It ran out of memory, started with warnings. And then as I started going towards that 60 milestone, it started really like crashing, and I couldn't have pretty much anything else open while I had the Figma library open. So it was a big problem. And so it needed a bit of attention, and consumers weren't feeling that much. They said like, oh, it's a bit slow, but it's not a big problem for us. How do you fix this, right? How do you fix Figma just crashing from the sheer amount of different variants that you have and all the lead and hidden stuff, right? So of course, obviously, right? Every layer counts towards memory. So you remove as much hidden layers as possible, right? The other option is you split the library into several files. And then there's like a game-changing new Figma feature that I'm going to be talking about. Probably most of you already know about it, but I'm just going to further put the nail down on the complexity. You've seen the button, the base button. You've seen that in a button where there's only a label, there's 4 hidden layers, right, on each button. If you then add 40 buttons in one page, which is kind of like an optimistic scenario, you had 160 hidden layers. And you add this to every button, to every component in the library, and you start seeing that you have a lot of stuff going on there. And Figma needs to keep that in memory. Figma needs to remember that that stuff exists in case you change to a variant where that layer is shown. So to fix this was always a risky business. Any of the changes, the fixes that we've looked at before, that kind of meant breaking changes eventually, right? It was high risk. The good thing was I talked with the consumer teams, and they were saying like, oh, we are not really doing anything huge right now, so breaking changes will not affect us that much. We're going to start creating new campaigns. We're going to start standardizing pages into templates. So then we need things to be good by then, right? And they were kind of like busy for around 15 days or up to three weeks, because the marketing assets on the website ran out of basically validity. Like you had to pay more to the photographer after a year. So we just updated the photography banks, and so they were all busy like just updating hundreds of pages on 32 different countries. So a lot of work from my design team went on there while I was just fixing the issue. So they said like, hey, everything that breaks can break before we do the heavy work, but after that, please don't do it. So we went with splitting the library. It was kind of like the safest route in theory, right? And splitting the library between 2 files, right? It's easier to split the library into different files if you follow like a system architecture, like atomic design. In this case, and just like the previous design systems I worked on, there's always a bit of like confusion, not with what the atom is, because that's kind of obvious. It's the smallest thing, right? Like a button. But what's the difference between a molecule and an organism? No one really knows. It's always a bit kind of like thin line. So what I've been doing, and a lot of people do, is like, let's just merge molecules and organisms, and then let's use our own taxonomy so that we don't make a confusion between who knows atomic and who doesn't. So in the Gauss's case, we use elements instead of atoms, and then everything else was a module up until the template phase. So that's how it was a bit easy mentally to split into different files. Of course, like this is one of the wisest quotes out there. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. This is chaos theory. Failure will happen. No matter how much you think it's not going to happen, it will. So we had breaking changes, right? So Figma has a lot of articles about how to split libraries in 2. And so I thought like, oh, I did everything right. And then when I went to update the library on a working file, I noticed that some components, not a lot of them, like 5 or 6 out of the 60 plus, just reset, because that's what happens. Like the component is no longer the same, the layers are no longer the same. So the content just disappears, all the overrides are gone. And what I did was, in order to split the library between files, if you have base buttons or base components, and they are private, right? Meaning that they have an underscore or a dot behind them, which means that they will not be published to the consumers. They will just be used internally to build other components. So what you need to do is you first need to make them public, publish them, and then after you publish them, you can now cut the component and move it to another file. What happened was, like, I probably, after 50 or so components, got a bit distracted and forgot to publish a couple of base components. So when I kind of like published the two different files into different libraries, things kind of broke. But that was a good thing, because component properties that came out like a week or two before this. And I kind of like evaluated it, and I said, like, yeah, this is going to break the entire system to move from base components towards components properties. But after talking with my team and explaining to them like what happened and that things broke, they were like, yeah, we're still not using it. You can, if you think you have it done within like the next 15 days, you can go ahead and just refactor everything to use component properties, which is what I did. But let's talk a little bit about the advantages of component properties, right? You get less variance to maintain. In the case of the buttons, we're talking about 972 variants, and after component properties, 324 variants. It's a one-third. It's a one-third gain. If this gain replicates it towards the entire library, you're gonna have one-third of the size, which means one-third of the performance need from your computer, which is a good thing in this case. They're also easier to use. All the little toggles, all the inputs are surfaced to the designers and other stakeholders. It can closely mirror the component properties in code, like props in React, right? It's if you align with the developers, the structure, right? So you can have the size variant, but you can also have it in code. And then the other good thing is for content designers, aka UX writers, because some people might not know what content design is at this point, and other stakeholders, they're able to really like change everything that can be changed on a component without really having to dig through the right layer. So if you also use an annotation like this is a label, right? And you put the pencil, this is where you change an input, or you put where you can actually change one component to the other, like the icon. You can now get like a very powerful system without having people like clicking through layers and layer mining on the file, being kind of like afraid of breaking something or hiding the wrong thing. Then the upside also is with now the nested components that came out on beta, you can actually start doing this with components that are inside components. So you can surface like all the properties of the nested components on the right panel. And then you get like something really powerful. So component properties, I mean, it was awesome. Thank you, Figma. Thank you, Jacob and team. Jacob is the PM for the design systems area at Figma, and he has been doing like great things ever since he came on board. So refactor all the things, right? It's me coding myself, a little bit narcissistic, but who can resist, right? So in the end, when I made the math, it meant that for 7 days, I just refactored. And that's how long it took. And when I mean I just refactored, it was pretty much, I told everyone, we need to fix this as soon as possible. We need to refactor as much as possible. I'm just going to attend design rituals and stand-ups in the morning. And the rest of my day is going to be 100% just refactoring all the components. So yes, I felt like I worked fast. There are hacks to work fast, right? There's ways to work fast. So one of them is to actually plan what you're doing, including like a plan for a failure case, right? And communicating clearly with stakeholders, letting them know exactly what you're going to do so that you can focus on that work. The other one is work smarter, but not harder, or not harder. So instead of doing a change to every single variant one at one, like I've seen people doing that during work, like on mockups. They have 5 different cards that they need to change, and so they select the card, then they change the property on that one card, and they go to the other card. Why not just selecting the 5 cards and do the thing once? I mean, if you add up on a work day, if you do everything in batches, work gets done faster. And then the other one is, I mean, Figma plugins are lifesavers. Like, they are your friends. Always use plugins. Always wonder, like, if you're gonna do something very repetitive, I'm pretty sure someone thought about making a plugin for that. So always go look for it. Like, as soon as it's, oh, I'm spending way too much time doing this very boring task, always go look for an automation. Always go look for a plugin. So I'm gonna talk about like 3 plugins. Filter, which is an awesome one. What Filter does is you can select all your variants or all bunch of layers, and then you can find things that you have in common between all of those variants. Now, it can be like the image shows, like just finding all the text. But now, if you actually named your layers, which I hope if you're working on a Figma library for other people to consume, you actually do, now you can find all layers that are named label. And now you can change all the labels in one go, right? So you can change all the fonts on all the labels in one go. Select layers does the same, but focuses more on like only finding things that have the same name. So it's like the same thing, but sometimes you might need one or the other to achieve the same result. In hindsight, and I did not use it for the refactor, Automator is also awesome. Automator is basically a tool to visually program like repetitive actions without having to actually do them. So it's a bit of code powers on Figma. And it's awesome for anything that's repetitive, for anything that's selecting one layer, doing something, and then moving to the next one. I have used it for things like automating basically color guidelines, right? Like where you have, hey, you have like 100 color shapes with just a different style. So you can use Automator to just pick the color name, pick the X value, pick the RGB value, and just automate all of that. So you click one button, you get the entire update. So takeaways. So, I mean, even the best practices can fire. Like, we all kind of like fall back on best practices, like best practices for like UX patterns, best practices for how not to fail. But that does not mean it will not happen. That just means you're kind of getting a little bit more insurance that it will not happen. But the good thing is, like, failure is like tough, but it always allows you to learn. And this is the cliche part. You will not do the same mistake again, hopefully, if the failure was hard enough. The other trick thing, and I think Amy also went there, is being vulnerable and being transparent, right? Letting people know when you failed or when you're about to fail, and just like allowing them to organize with you a way to recover from that failure. And that means you need to be transparent, like, oh, oops, I broke things. And allow people to know as soon as possible. Like, let them know, oh, I broke this component, I'm gonna fix it, wait another hour before updating. Just be sure that you're really like communicating clearly. And it's like, apologies are great, right? You should apologize like every time that you fail, every time that you do something wrong. But you also kind of like, the way to recover from failure is to make sure that you figure out something that helps your team, and you really like try to make up for the blunder with making something that's really better for them in the long term. So that's how they forgive you. That's, as long as you're giving them like something that's better for them, even if you failed a lot and you cost them a lot of work, they're going to forgive you sooner or later. So was it a success in the end? No, not, I mean, it was a little bit of a success, but then there was a bit of a last bump, right? So you saw there was one library, then you go to 2 libraries. In the mindset of like the maintainer, not a big problem, right? But for consumers means that if they want the component from one library and they think they're looking on the other one, right? You start getting like if it's on the left panel, that's okay. But if it's on the right panel, you actually need to be on the right library to find the component. So if you want to change one component from the elements library for one component, the modules library, you need to remember that, or you need to just say all libraries. So that was a bit of a consumer issue. In my last 2 weeks at Klarna, I kind of tested merging them back together. And I did this in another environment because I didn't want to break any more things. And so the refactoring, using component properties, the optimizations that Figma made, which they made a lot. There's actually an awesome Schema 2022 talk about how they made component properties, where they talk about exactly the performance issues that come with hidden layers. And they actually made it so that hidden layers don't cost so much memory for the users. So it's a really awesome one that you should find. So basically, going back at what I was going at, the performance issues were gone. Like I merged them back together. I used it for a few hours and I was like, okay, they could be back together. So I documented that. I made sure to make a lot of notes. And so whoever comes after me knows that, hey, we can merge them back together. We know how to move things because I have explained very carefully the whole publish the hidden components thing. But now also there's no hidden components almost. Like there's like 2 or 3 in the entire library. That's it. It's a wrap. And I think it's time for Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was super, super great. Some great insights there. Always great to learn from others' experiences. And definitely component props were lifesavers. Yeah, I was really happy as well when they were introduced. We do have some questions here. So if you're up for it, I might
let's
go ahead and ask you. Okay, so someone actually asked, how do you handle handoff when you have a library that is that complex?
Yes. So there's like Amy kind of like was really good at putting that point across. It really depends on the organization, right? In my case at Klarna, the design system developers were in my team. So we were all kind of like sitting together virtually. So they knew what I was working on and we could work very closely together. The biggest trick on end off is not to have an end off as much as possible, right? Like involve people very early, allow them to also give you feedback like, oh, okay, I see that you set it up this way, but in code this would work another way. I think that is key, especially if you don't have that coding knowledge, like you have no clue how these things are built in code, then you really need to work together with the developer, which adds the extra challenge, right? Now you need a developer that understands that you need systems in order to start it up.
Yeah, no, definitely. Communication is always the way, for sure. I think we have some more questions coming in here. So let's just check. Someone is asking a very controversial question about if you have any thoughts on the impact of Figma recent acquisition by Adobe. Asking the big questions here. You can choose not to answer that one if you'd like.
No, because it's funny, because I think on the short term, no consequences at all. These big mergers between these large corporations take way more than 1 year to actually happen, right? It's just integrating people from one company to the other takes a while. So in the next 1 or 2 years, I can almost be sure that nothing will happen. So now the trick is from the people that remember what happened with Micromedia stuff like freehand and the old stuff. Adobe doesn't have a good track record, but I think in this case,
Oh,
I
I think it's breaking up. I don't know if it's my internet.
Right? I'm hopeful. I think we're gonna have
I think it's
better
Thiago's
interlinked up on
connection.
Figma, which hopefully it's better. So that one is that. Like
Oh, you're
I'm
back.
optimist. I was unstable. Yes.
Looks like
Yeah,
you're
now
back.
you're back. All good.
Perfect. I think we got the gist of most of it. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. Another quick question here. Where do you draw the line regarding code parity, parity between, you know, naming in Figma and naming in code? Where do you draw the line? How much that needs to be aligned from your perspective?
It needs to be aligned enough so that you can speak the same language. And what I mean with this, it doesn't need to match one-on-one. Like if it can, better, right? So I can tell you, like when I started, like they had already started the work with the consultant, like at Klarna on the website, right? And when I started, like things were very developer oriented. And I gathered feedback from my team, on the team of designers that were working on the website, and they were like, "We don't get it. Like, we don't get it. We can't use it." So that's key, right? Like, align just to the point where your consumers still can use it, right? They might not be able to use it if you really align 100%.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's true. Even you mentioned component props in Figma closely align with how they're set up in React, but sometimes they don't. So for my personal experience getting feedback from developers, sometimes it's just better to call them Figma props, so there isn't that divide there. Yeah, I guess case by case, it'll vary. I think, do we have time for one more question, if that's all right? Someone asking another big question here. Oh, maybe one is just more practical. I think you mentioned 3 plugins there. I don't know if you mind just repeating them. Maybe some people have missed them.
Yes.
I remember Automator for sure.
Automator, and then you have filter, which is really just the name. And then you have select layers. And from the same author of select layers, you have sort layers, which is nothing to do with select layers. What it actually does is it like sorts the layers on the left side by their position on the artboards, like on the canvas, right? Like the Figma canvas, or by alphabetical order. So kind of like interesting one. But I think like this presentation will be pretty much on YouTube after, and you can always reach out. You go to my website or to LinkedIn, and not so active on Twitter in this case, so you get like a taste of different people. Like if you want Twitter, not me, you go to Amy.
Amazing. And so, well, LinkedIn, can people reach you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, sure. Like
Okay.
I mean, if I get 1,000 messages tomorrow, I won't be able to answer, but up until now I've been able to.
Cool. That's great. Thank you thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your story, and yeah, failure that turned into success. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so
It's a
much.
better story. It's a nice story.
It is.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
so much, Thiago. Great talk. Also, I really love your background. Where the fuck are you? Are you in which room are you? It looks like a
It's the
hotel room.
bedroom, right? And
Wow.
then I'm facing a wall. I don't have white walls, so then it's less light. So you pros and cons with everything.
So cool. So you have been a long time member of Into Design Systems and also attending our last conference. Any
Yes,
last
it was
words
awesome.
about this community and now being a speaker? Anything you would like to share?
Yeah, I think I really want to like just like incentivize people to also start speaking, right? Like start recording like maybe some Loom videos, like start doing small things. And then at some point you're gonna start doing like more complex stuff. But don't be afraid to be out there. Like just really be vulnerable.